Ahead of our April auction here at Manor Park Classics, we are privileged to be in the presence of a 996 Porsche 911. A car that up until very recently has been harshly judged by many of the Porsche faithful as being a corruption of the original 911 formula. But as the original 911, as the 964 and the 993 have grown so ruinously expensive, these cars not only now look like a bargain, but owing to the fact that they are now coming up to 30 years of age, have become an engineering and style icon totally in their own right. So in this video for you today, I want to talk a little bit about why the 996 had to exist, why it existed in the form it did, how really it saved the Porsche 911 as a whole, you could even say Porsche as a company as well, then why it's really started to become a bit of a classic, and of course we will go for a drive. But it's actually that second point I want to talk about first, because it personally relates to me and how I view this car. So these Porsche 911s were introduced in 1997, a year after the 986 Boxster, which of course looked very similar, shared a lot of its engineering, shared a lot of its componentry as well. And I think that might have been the first reason why some people didn't take too kindly to these cars. I digress, however, we will get to that. But being launched in 1997, it's 3 years older than me, this car. And so when I was a kid, when I was going around and saw cool sports cars, if I saw a 911, it was probably one of these. This was the current 911 when I was a kid. And so I'm 24 years of age now, I'm 25 this year. And so for people who are my age, people who are now, even going to go up into their 30s, this is the 911 from their childhood. So as with all classic cars, the nostalgia factor plays a huge role. That's why so many people want MGBs, for example, and things like that. People might want, a Triumph TR7 or whatever, because they're the cars that when they were kids, they grew up and thought, that's really, really cool. And so when I was a kid, it was cars like this 996 911 that really spoke to me. And so we can see in that context, I can't believe these cars are nearly 30 years old now, but that they are getting to that era. In fact, an early one of these is only 12 years away from in the UK being registered as an historic vehicle. And that makes these really very old indeed now. It's funny, isn't it, how kind of the motor industry has slowed down in a way, in that everything seems to stick around for slightly longer now. But anyway, I want to talk about the 996 and how it came about, because Porsche, ever since the beginning, back in the late 1940s and the early 1950s, were a very, very small company. The idea of Porsche as we know them today, very much under the wing of the Volkswagen Group and a total commercial juggernaut, not only producing the 911, also the Boxster and the Cayman, of course the Cayenne and the Macan and the Panamera and the Taycan. All of these different model lines now exist for Porsche. They make huge numbers of cars and they are still deified by many motoring enthusiasts, and rightly so. I love Porsche, you probably love Porsche, we all love Porsche. But that commercial juggernaut they are today just did not exist 30 years ago when this car was being developed. So back in the early days of Porsche, let's say in the 1950s and up to the early 60s, the kind of era when they were building the 356, that is kind of all they did. Now sure, they went racing, but in terms of the commercial side, in terms of selling production cars, it was really the 356. That was Porsche's bread and butter. And when that car was replaced in 1963 by the original 911, they again continued down that path. And up until 1970, this is kind of all they built. They built the 911, and that's really an end of it. So Porsche made their money partly from selling this single sports car and selling it really very well, but also through freelancing, essentially, through providing engineering work to other manufacturers who wanted to outsource for one reason or another. There are a number of cars throughout history, especially in the 1980s, where Porsche ended up having their names emblazoned over non-Porsche cars. So there were Mercedes-Benz, there were Seats even, that had Porsche bits beneath them, Porsche bits in them, because Porsche were hired to do that work, and for many years that is how Porsche survived. Now, of course, Porsche have always had an intrinsic relationship with Volkswagen. They had to, at the end of the day. They came from kind of the same melting pot, the same group of people, etc. And so they've always been connected at the hip, really. But throughout the 1960s and 1970s, while Volkswagen modernized and moved on from the old Beetle, a lot of their engineering work was done by Porsche. It sounds a little bit silly to think today, but that is kind of what Porsche were. Porsche were kind of a consultant. They ran a consultancy and they did work for other manufacturers. And so in 1960 something, late 1960s, when Porsche wanted a new entry-level sports car to replace the 912, Volkswagen also now wanted a new halo car, something to replace the Karmann Ghia. The two came together to create the 914. The Volkswagen Porsche 914 ran for 6 years, until 1976, before it was axed in favour of the kind of second generation of that car, really, the Porsche 924. Again, which was initially a collaboration between Volkswagen and Porsche, but Porsche did the majority of the work. Of course, Volkswagen supplied that Audi engine for the 924, and though it only ended up being badged as a proper Porsche and not a Volkswagen, owing to the oil crisis, internal dynamics, etc., that was now Porsche's entry-level sports car. The 924, with its front engine, rear drive layout, transaxle at the back as well, in that long bonnet, traditional coupe shape. And next to that, the original 911, which had now been around for 13 years, but don't forget its general character, rear engine layout, its general shape, etc., had been around for a heck of a lot longer than that. Porsche began to realise that they wanted to move away from the 911. And so, of course, in 1978, they debuted the 928, using a very similar, mechanical layout to the smaller 924, but with an all-new, all-alloy V8 up front, and of course, much more imposing, much more characterful styling. And so, entering the 1980s, that is the route that Porsche wanted to go down, producing big Grand Tourers rather than very unique, smaller sports cars. So that's all quite obvious. I'm sure most of the people watching this will have already known about all that kind of stuff. And while those cars sold in respectable numbers, by this point, Porsche's character, people's perceptions of Porsche were always grounded and centered around the original 911. And so by the end of the 1980s, the 928 beginning to age, they had to take a decision. Do we continue going on with the GTs, or do we prioritise our brilliant selling but very, very elderly sports car? Of course, they ended up going with the 911. They introduced the 964 in 1989 and then the 993 in, I think, 1993, maybe 1994. But those two cars were, again, extensions upon the original 911. So they still had a lot of 1960s-ness to them. They felt very much like a brand new classic car. And while that is brilliant from an enthusiast perspective, us weirdos love that kind of thing, it's not so great when it comes to winning round new customers, winning around new fans, and winning over people that might not have necessarily been into the original 911. By the mid-1990s, the 968, which the 924 had by now become, was starting to go out of production. The 928 would also go out of production in 1995, and Porsche again found themselves at a crossroads. They had again this very elderly sports car in the form of the 993 911, which wasn't going to meet emission standards, that wasn't going to meet crash safety standards, that was looking seriously outmoded compared to the latest and greatest sports cars from some other manufacturers, and they had a range of GTs and smaller sports cars that were beginning to die off. Porsche in this era were very close to ending up on the brink of bankruptcy, because they just were not bringing in the money. They did not have the volumes of scale to compete with other manufacturers. And of course, as the car market changed through the 80s and 90s, this very outdated view of the world that Porsche had just could not stand up anymore. And so they had to engineer an all-new 911. But while the 911 was an intrinsic part of Porsche's character in terms of how Porsche now saw themselves, you know, their styling would all be centered around a general 911-y kind of silhouette, they realized that profits were actually in the smaller sports cars, in the more affordable sports cars, what the 924, 944 and 968 were, but had kind of failed to live up to. As a result, in this era, Porsche decided to develop an all-new, water-cooled, this time, flat six, of course, which would power the next 911. They decided to create a totally new chassis with bang up-to-date crash structures at the front, to have up-to-date aerodynamics, and also to look very modern in terms of its character. This new Porsche would still unmistakably look like a Porsche, but it would take away the awkwardness and the uprightness that had become a part of the 964 and 993, whether they liked it or not, because they were based on the original 911. But as the smaller car was the priority, that is the one that had to be launched first. And owing to the fact that they had to share so much between these two cars, it used that same all-new engine. It used a lot of the same interior fittings, interior trim, and of course, because it's Porsche and Porsche wanted to buy into their own image, it looked very much like a 911. Of course, this car launched in 1996 as the 986 Porsche Boxster, a car that, you know, we've all now come to absolutely love. It's a gem with its mid-engine layout, convertible top, etc., and it looks fantastic. But because it looks so modern and so different, but still unmistakably Porsche, when they came along with the 911 the following year, people thought it looked too similar, as if the 911 had been cheapened by association with the Boxster, rather than having a car like the 944, which looked nothing like a 911 and therefore couldn't buy in to Porsche's own heritage. It's funny what perception can do to these cars, but doing what I do, there are so many instances where a car appears out of the blue to many people in whatever year, and there is nothing fundamentally wrong with it, but because people are a little bit nervous about it, or because people are a little bit skeptical about it, that new perception permeates throughout society, and then people become naturally skeptical of something. That is what began to happen with the 996 911. But people, of course, realised that it was a brilliant car. Not only did that new water-cooled engine meet better emission standards, but it produced 300 brake horsepower as well, a very, very healthy figure. It was potentially more reliable, though there were some faults early on, than the old air-cooled engines, but it was certainly much more efficient, and it was also much smoother, much quieter, much more fitting for a truly modern car, rather than something that Porsche had tried to keep up to date over the decades and over the years. Similarly, this new body had a drag coefficient of only 0.3, which made it very, very slippery indeed back in 1997, partly due to this really, really small front end area and just very narrow grills underneath to feed the radiators and such. But with this much more sleeked back, much more curvaceous body, very, very 90s though it looks today, of course, the headlamps were the biggest feature. The headlamps are what people started to talk about, initially referring to them as runny egg headlamps, owing to the orange indicators in the front. Of course, this later car doesn't have that, but nonetheless, these kind of molten headlamps are very, very characteristic of the 996, and as I said, were controversial back in the day. But today, they appear as being very classic, very 90s, and very, very curvaceous, but at the same time, owing to the fact that it still had to look like a 911, it's also very timeless. There are a few cars that can really toe that line between being quite retro when brand new and now looking retro but towards the 90s today, yet still also very timeless because they still build a 911. It's a little bit confusing for me to maybe try and get out and get across to you, but these cars manage to toe a brilliant line between elegance, between sporting intent, between timelessness, and also being classic as well. There is an awful lot to be said for the 996 911. But of course, in still being a 911, it wasn't going to totally corrupt the formula. It was still going to have a flat six engine, and it was still going to be mounted at the back. Of course, the point of the 911, the reason people still wanted 911s, is because they were so usable. You of course have the boot up front, but you also have 4 seats. And though they are very small, you could use them for children. If you don't have children, then you have a whole load of luggage space back here. The 911 has always marked itself out from the rest of the sports/supercar crowd by just being sensible, by being very Germanic in a sense. And that is why something like this, something that is coming up to 30 years of age now, still paints such a very interesting and also very tempting choice. But with all that useless bile out of the way, I think it's time for the most important thing, because we have a 911 before us, so we must go for a drive. So, as I mentioned earlier, we have 300 brake horsepower from our all-new 3.4 litre water-cooled flat six. But quite frankly, being really honest here, who cares? You know, in the constant race for performance supremacy, in the race for manufacturers to just make their cars faster and faster and faster for absolutely no reason whatsoever, it just makes sports cars stupid. Sports cars, in my view, should be always relevant to the roads in which they're supposed to be driven on. Sports cars should always feel fast, of course, it's a sports car, but it shouldn't be too fast. It should be fast enough that it makes you go, wow, we're going quite quickly, but slow enough that you're not doing stupid, illegal speeds absolutely all the time. At the end of the day, if you've got a lovely flat six behind you, you want to be able to hear it. And that is why something like this, with just 300 brake horsepower, a mere 300 brake horsepower, which would have been an incredible amount only 10 years before this, 300 brake horsepower was a huge number. And so, if I just rev match slightly down into second gear, we can get a nice little punch out of that, and we're not going stupidly quickly. And of course, we have a manual gearbox as well with us. 6-speed manual, and everything falls so nicely to hand. Unlike many more modern cars, we don't have an overly thick steering wheel. Instead, this allows you to just kind of direct the car very gently. Lovely steering wheel though it is, nice 3-spoke design, but it's very simple. There are no controls on it. And you don't have this overly thick rim. You just have these 2 little kind of nodules where you might want to put your thumbs underneath. And that's all. It means that the car feels so much more delicate than it otherwise would. So much more delicate than it would feel if we were in something more modern. And that goes for the steering as well, because while of course the tyres are really quite wide on this car, if I can get my words out, they are not so wide as to totally remove any kind of steering feel. And because you've got McPherson struts at the front, this thing is lovely. Because you have McPherson struts at the front rather than something a little bit more sophisticated, it means that you get a bit of delicacy. You might not get all of the control in the world, but it means that there's a lot of feel in everything, and the nice hydraulic power steering. So I've driven a number of sports cars from this kind of era, maybe from the 80s through to the 90s really, rather than from the 90s through to the noughties. But driving cars like that, the problem with a lot of them is that the power steering, which is necessary because of the width of the front tyres, because of the weight over the front wheels, in this case we don't have that of course, but the power steering then ruins the car because you might have a great chassis underneath you, but with overly light steering you can't do anything with it. In this, however, you can still feel the steering weight up. You can feel yourself get to the edge of grip, and you can feel it just scrabble very, very, very gently as you apply and you lose steering angle. And by this point, Porsche had really gotten the hang of doing a rear-mounted engine. Of course, it gives you all the practicality. There's so much space behind me, not necessarily for real, human-sized people or adult-sized people anyway, but instead space for things, space to be able to go and do things in your Porsche 911. So this does not feel like a supercar. Supercars are unnecessary. They're all about appearance. They're all about showing off and being flashy. This Porsche is not that. This is a sports car, a proper sports car, where it is relatively restrained. It's relatively understated. This car is in silver with a grey interior, for goodness sake. Porsches are bought by people who do not feel the need to pose. They don't feel the need to look at other cars and other people and say, I want to look like that. Porsche people are very confident in themselves and are very understated, and they see the benefit of having that extra practicality, of having this body shape where it's not too low, certainly not too tall either. It is a really practical, usable thing, as every 911 is. Let's be honest, I'm not saying anything here that is different from any other 911. Nothing here is particular to the 996, but it's just a part of why Porsche had to keep going with the 911. They couldn't have not, when they had such a brilliant formula on their hands, one that now I don't think anyone else can copy. Because if anyone else does copy something like this, then it just looks like they're copying Porsche. Porsche have a brilliant monopoly on this kind of car, and I just love it. I think it's absolutely fantastic. And you can't beat a 6-cylinder engine. I love straight sixes. V6s are nice, they're all well and good, but they're not quite as smooth as a straight six. But this flat six, it has a slightly different character again. It has that 6-cylinder soundtrack, that sonority, but it's not quite as smooth. Doesn't quite have what the straight sixes have, and somehow that makes it more suitable for a sports car. But another thing that this engine is tractable. So I've just pulled away there, I'm going quite slowly, but I'm pulled out of that roundabout. I've not stopped in third gear at just over 1,000 revs. And in many, more toppy sports car, supercar engines, that wouldn't be possible. But with Porsche having designed this engine to be a proper Porsche engine, it instead can do all the normal road traffic things, and that makes it so much more friendly. And as a result, when you do get on it, it makes it so much more rewarding. And all the controls are also nice, so the steering wheel is in a great position. The pedals, initially they feel a little bit odd, a little bit unusual, but they very, very quickly feel natural. The gear change is brilliant on this car as well. It's not too sure to throw, but it's quite snickety. And you always just have that soundtrack behind you. And it's so much better to have that noise coming from behind you than it is from in front of you, just by virtue of it being slightly exotic. I must admit, this is my first ever go in a 911, and it is absolutely everything that I wanted it to be. I have driven Boxsters in the past and felt them a little bit underwhelming in a way, not because there's anything wrong with them per se, but just because they didn't meet my image of them. They didn't meet what I thought they would be. This absolutely does, however. So if you like the look of this car and want to beat me to it, although I couldn't afford something like this. This is a bit too nice for me. Then do please head over to our website. Struggling with my words today. It's late. Go and have a look at the photographs. Read the write-up on it. Read some of the history about this car, and make an appointment and even come and have a look at it for yourself. Not only do you then get to see the car and actually, experience it a little bit in the flesh, but also you can have a look at all the history with it. You can look at what makes this car this particular car. And if you enjoy these videos that we make over here, then please do click like and subscribe as well. It makes an enormous difference. The channel's grown quite a lot in the last year or so, and so for the time that I'm making videos here anyway, subscribe and you get more of them.